if you want freedom to thrive in the world, you can't be apathetic in Ukraine or potentially in Taiwan about an authoritarian effort to use overwhelming or intimidating force to snuff it out. This is partly a moral argument about defending the right of a free people to continue to determine their own future. But it's also a self-interested argument about do we want to live in a free world or not?
你好，我是吴一农，欢迎你来到节目的特别篇。今天我想好好说的是，经过大罢免，我们看到逐渐成熟的公民社会，很多人发动公民行动，去签名联署，去投票盖章，用自己的方式实践民主。当然，最后也尊重民主的选择。这让我想起在去年台湾总统大选的时候，我访问了美国史丹佛大学的民主学者 Larry Diamond。我们聊到了台湾的民主地位有多重要。Larry 也分享一些改善民主政治运作的方法。这一集我们回顾这段谈话，剪辑出一部分精华，献给努力提升台湾民主文化、推动政治改革的人。接下来是我跟 Larry 在2024年1月的谈话。
Dr. Larry Diamond, thank you so much for joining us. Before we start, I'd like to note that we are approaching 11 p.m., the night before you leave Taiwan. So I want to say thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
You are the author of a book called Ill Winds, and it is about protecting and saving democracy in the face of Russian rage, Chinese ambition, and American complacency. Mm-hmm. You've edited more than 40 books on democratic development. And so I'd like to, use the limited time you have with us today to talk about democracy.
Okay.
Your country, the United States and Taiwan, were both democratic countries, with slightly different histories. Can you tell us why the U.S. cares about Taiwan or should care about Taiwan?
I think there are several reasons why the U.S. does care about Taiwan and its ability to continue to determine its own future, and also why it should care about Taiwan. And there's a very broad bipartisan consensus in the Congress and more broadly in the American society about this. Different people may prioritize different things, but I'll give you a synthesis that I think is a fair representation of informed public opinion in the United States, including policymaking opinion. Number one, ask yourself, we should all ask ourselves, what would the world look like? What would East Asia look like if one of the most liberal democracies in the world, one of the most successful democracies of the so-called third wave of global democratization that began in the mid-1970s, could simply be extinguished by military force, by an aggressive, and I would say we could call it communist, but in some ways fascist might be a better term for it, neo-totalitarian regime. What would the world look like? What would the world look like for Japan? What would the world look like for Korea? What would the world look like for the Philippines? What would the world look like for East Asia? What would the world look like for the future of democracy globally? What would the world look like for the credibility of American commitments in Europe if we just stood by and said, nice little democracy you had there, sorry to see it go? I believe very strongly, I think we are seeing this in Ukraine and in a certain way in the terrorist attacks by Hamas on Israel. Democracy globally and the struggle for freedom in the world are indivisible. And you can't say that it matters somewhere, but it doesn't matter somewhere else. And let's appease an aggressive, self-aggrandizing authoritarian regime by giving them something or letting them have their way by force, and maybe they'll stop there. Now, I am not strictly comparing the People's Republic of China to Nazi Germany, but I think in its aggressive ambitions and its willingness to use force to acquire what it claims is its legitimate territory. After all, Nazi Germany did this as well with the Czech Republic and the alleged German lands of the Czech Republic, the Sudetenland, then with Austria and the Anschluss, then with Poland. Where does it end? So that's number one, that we cannot allow an expansionist, aggressive, neo-totalitarian regime to suffocate and extinguish a free, self-governing people by force.
Because if we did, where does it end? Right?
Because number one, doing so is morally unacceptable. And number two, that wouldn't be the end of it. And so there is a theory in international relations that I'm sure you know, and I think instinctively, if not literally, many of your listeners will know, called the bandwagon theory. That when there's a powerful international actor in the world, and it seems to be on a roll, to have momentum, and to be imposing its will, a lot of other countries decide, well, we better go with the winner.
Follow the bandwagon.
Yes, follow the bandwagon, and then it gains momentum. And sometimes that is, as it was with the Nazis in the 1930s and the fascists in Italy, and the communists in a similar period and in the 1960s, it generates its own momentum. It does have a snowballing effect. It does have a diffusing effect. And so, if you want freedom to thrive in the world, you can't be apathetic in Ukraine or potentially in Taiwan about an authoritarian effort to use overwhelming or intimidating force to snuff it out. This is partly a moral argument about defending the right of a free people to continue to determine their own future. But it's also a self-interested argument about, do we want to live in a free world or not, in which other countries will feel free to continue to ally with, partner with, trade with, and trust in a global circle of democracies.
What you just said reminds me of what Martin Luther King Jr. once said, which is, having this broader view of the world of humanity, of our place in it, something along the lines of injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Correct. There are a few quotes from Martin Luther King that are more urgently relevant to the current situation in Taiwan than this one. We must use time creatively. I hope we can come back to that. Second, there's a related geostrategic reason why we care about Taiwan. So I think the moral reason, the geopolitical reason, the solidarity of and indivisibility of democracy is number one. But number two is, if the People's Republic of China swallows Taiwan, they're going to turn it into a giant aircraft carrier for the People's Liberation Army, Navy, and Air Force. They're going to move their submarine base from Hainan Island to Taiwan, and they're going to control the entire western side of the Pacific. And of course, we know they're already moving on a lot of the Pacific Islands with the goal of controlling everything in the Pacific Ocean from, Hawaii west, basically. And, probably if you're Americans and you are inclined to be apathetic about all of this, maybe you shouldn't even be so certain about Hawaii. But if they succeeded in doing this and projecting power out from Taiwan and militarizing Taiwan once they swallowed it, the future of Japan would be very, very grim. They would be able to choke the maritime supply lines to Japan, to the Korean Peninsula, and really, they're already making such severe and outrageous inroads into the South China Sea. They would just kind of finish the job there. The United States would be, this is the PRC goal, they're not making any bones about it, push the United States out of Asia altogether, economically and geopolitically, and become the undisputed hegemonic power, at least in the Indo-Pacific region, the one to which all other countries would have to pay tribute and obeisance. That's the second thing.
If I may, just and I don't want to end up digressing, but I do want to help our listeners just clarify that point you mentioned just now. What of the view, which I don't subscribe to, but let's air it here. What of the view that a growing power, emerging superpower ought to have or can reasonably be expected to desire that kind of influence in its own backyard, thousands of miles from U.S. shores. So what if China succeeded in reshaping this part of the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific?
I would say let mainland China become a democracy with a transparent government, a rule of law, a constitutional court, an open civil society, the ability to debate foreign, military, and international policy within the society. And then we can have that conversation. As long as the People's Republic of China is not really a people's republic, but a communist party state with grandiose ambitions of domineering and intolerant control of its population, and essentially no political and civil freedom, and no rule of law, and everything subordinate to the Communist Party and to the paramount leader of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, by far the most totalitarian leader of China since Mao Zedong. Who in Asia wants to live under that shadow?
Why would we be okay with that influence growing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, China's claim, let's put it in a more positive way. China's claim to be, ambition to be the leading power, at least in East Asia, stretching from Northeast Asia through Southeast Asia, would be more open to debate if it were a more open society governed by the rule of law and it weren't so concentrating and abusing of power internally and externally.
Yeah.
And then there's the little fact, the minor fact, that there happens to be another Asian country that now is actually got more people than China and a significantly faster rate of growth than China, that will have something to say about that view in the coming decades, namely India. So, let the people of Asia speak for themselves here. The third issue, and I actually do think it is third, though it is daunting and existential, is the semiconductor industry. And we cannot allow a totalitarian state to control the majority of the world's supply of semiconductors. Now, worse still, possibly, might be the scenario of the People's Republic of China attempting to take Taiwan by force and severely disrupting or potentially largely destroying the semiconductor industry here on this island. I can tell you what many experts have written publicly and said privately. There would almost immediately emerge a global economic depression on the order of the 1930s if the supply of semiconductors globally from its epicenter here in Taiwan was severely disrupted or damaged. So, we want a free and open global supply chain for semiconductors. It's a very integrated industry, as you know, globally. But Taiwan leads. Taiwan will continue to lead into the indefinite future, in my view, because it hosts here some of the most successful technology companies, which is really to say some of the most successful companies in the history of the world, none more so than Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. And that's not going to change.
CHIPS Act notwithstanding. Right.
No matter how many plants TSMC builds in the United States, and at this point, we'll be happy if it's 2 or 3. No matter how many it builds in Japan, maybe eventually here and there, Vietnam, India, wherever, Taiwan is going to remain the heart of production, certainly the heart of organization and innovation. And it's important to the global economy and the economic security of democracies around the world that supply chain be free and open.
Do you see rooms for security cooperation between the United States and Taiwan? Do you see common gaps that we can work together to resolve?
Taiwan must develop more robust, capable, and energetic postures in 3 respects. Number one, it must have more resilience. And resilience has a military element to it. It means the ability to absorb military blows. If, God forbid, it should come to this, even military attacks, and bounce back, hit back, and successfully repel attack and defend the island. Resilience also means survival in a societal and economic sense. And we can come to this, but it means that if there should be an attack on Taiwan or an effort to strangle and intimidate the island through a naval blockade or a quarantine, resilience would mean that Taiwan has the ability to resist this intimidation and maintain a decent level of economic and societal functioning until international friends and partners could arrive here in sufficient strength to break the blockade. And so both these dimensions of resilience are absolutely critical, military and non-military. And then, if you talk about what else Taiwan needs, we can get into this, but it can't just be, hang on until the cavalry arrives, namely the United States Navy and Air Force or the Japanese submarines or whatever it might be. Taiwan must have more military deterrent and retaliatory strength militarily. Taiwan must have not only a robust, energetic, better resourced, and larger military with more people ready to and trained to come to Taiwan's military defense, and in the vein of the work you have been doing in the Forward Alliance, societal emergency readiness, if there should be a military emergency of some kind. To put it baldly, the Navy and Air Force need more investment relative to the Army. If you look at what's going to make a difference in the defense of Taiwan. And in particular, I'll just say most American security experts, including my colleagues at Hoover, who have studied this, believe that the general idea of the overall defense concept, a lot of small things rather than a few big lumbering, M1 Abrams tanks and a few big bombers and things like that, are what Taiwan needs, so that these can be distributed around the island. They can be very mobile. They can be very smart. They can survive a first strike. They can hit lethal blows. They can sink Chinese naval vessels in large numbers that are trying to sail across the strait to make an amphibious landing if it should come to that. And even though many people doubt that that is the way China would try to, quote, take Taiwan, end quote, but it can't be ruled out. So reform means that there needs to be not only larger investment, more investment, but a very different kind of structure. And look, I just think it needs to be said. People in Taiwan are saying it. People in Europe are saying it. People in the United States are saying it. These are all people who love Taiwan, who want to see it survive, who admire the miracle that's been built on this island. The margin for error is narrowing, okay? And the time horizon is narrowing. And if Taiwan doesn't prepare better, smarter, more vigorously to defend itself smartly and effectively, and thereby also increase considerably the odds that it will deter military aggression, its chances of survival will dramatically diminish over the next decade.
But I want to talk about how you address such emotional and contentious issues. Speaking of democracy and democratic development, how do we encourage civil society, citizens to have that sort of as rational as possible debate?
So I can tell you how we've started doing it in the United States, and it's through a certain form of rational policy deliberation. Sometimes I think we underappreciate the virtues of democratic practices, and just having an election or having a referendum, which referenda generally can descend into very emotional and symbolic and frankly shallow national dialogues. There are other ways of doing this. And one way, which we've been experimenting with at Stanford in our deliberative democracy lab with some considerable success, is what we call a deliberative poll. You select a random sample of a public. In this case, it could be a random sample of the roughly 24 million people in Taiwan, and representative of the diversity of the country. almost a kind of jury, but not of 12 people, maybe of 400 or 500. And you give them a fair, balanced, accessible, but comprehensive briefing paper on the issues. You assemble a set of experts with different points of view. This is very important. And they ensure that the information in the briefing paper is factual, and that they each have a chance to make their pro and con arguments about different policy proposals in the briefing paper and in a way that's accessible to the public. Then you divide these 500 randomly selected people into groups of roughly 12 who are going to be deliberating in these groups over the course of the exercise. And they start going through each proposal and the arguments for and against, and they talk with one another and they think about it. And nobody has, I hope, in such a scenario, we try and work very hard on this in our own exercises. No one comes in wearing a green shirt or a blue shirt or a white hat saying KP or anything else. They just come in as individuals, willing to listen and learn and share their own views. And often we see, as a result of the dialogue and a result of something else that happens in these deliberative polls, which is the small groups each have to formulate questions that they're going to ask in a plenary session to experts with different points of view. And then they also then meet either as a group of 500 or if it's an online deliberative poll, which we also have the technology to do. Everybody gathers together to watch the experts online, but they hear their questions asked and they hear experts with different points of view answer them. And then they also kind of begin to make up their mind about who's more persuasive, who's more compelling. And then they go back and talk about it with their peers again. We did this in a deliberative poll on climate and energy during COVID, September of 2021. And we got very significant changes in public opinion in the United States in the direction of greater support for renewable energy, greater support and investment for energy innovation by the U.S. federal government, significantly greater understanding of how urgent the issue of climate change is. And partly because of all of that, it might surprise you to hear, greater support for nuclear energy, because they came to see that it was an important element of the mix to get us to a carbon zero emissions, a net carbon zero economy. In any case, I think you need to get beyond symbolism, beyond shouting, beyond election campaigns, and enable people to seriously deliberate on these issues.
Now, when you start out on this in this exercise, you don't come out with a desired outcome, to be clear.
Otherwise, you drain the process of its credibility. It's got to be fair. It's got to be open-ended. And it's got to trust in the wisdom of the crowd. In other words, democracy.
You told me that one of the issues you looked into was political reform.
Yeah.
And something that I think would be quite interesting to our listeners is why you look at this. Why was this question even posed? Right? What problem are you trying to solve?
Well, we were talking about political reform in the United States. Why did we look at this issue? Because the United States is an increasingly polarized, troubled, hysterical, and deficient democracy. And many scholars of democracy, myself included, feel there are a number of reforms that we should consider adopting, we might adopt, that would improve the functioning of democracy, increase trust in democracy, and reduce political polarization. Just to mention two or three, if I may, One is a series of changes in the way we vote and administer elections to increase trust in elections so we can have more audits of the vote, transparent recounting of the vote. I personally think that there should be no election that takes place anywhere in a democracy that doesn't produce a paper record of the vote that can be recounted. And a lot of computer scientists think we should move away from electronic voting altogether, including on voting machines, and vote purely by paper so that it can be recounted to a higher level of integrity. We have problems with absentee ballots. What do you allow? What don't you? And then the polarizing combination in the United States of single-member district, first past the post elections, which is what you have in the majority of your Lee-Fa-Yuen seats, and party primaries, which are very low turnout, that tend to favor, particularly in the Republican Party, more extreme nominees. So what can you do? Well, there are a number of reforms we could adopt in the U.S., and they gain support to make it easier to vote and to register to vote. In fact, to register to vote, register people to vote automatically, and to make the process of counting the vote more transparent, to remove the ridiculous system we have in the United States, where the people who oversee elections in each of the states in the United States are themselves partisan elected officials who may have their own ambition to be, say, governor or senator from their state. Can you imagine how ludicrous people in Taiwan would feel it would be if, the person running elections in Chiayi County wanted to be the next, magistrate of the county, or might be overseeing the election in which they were running to be the county executive. It's absurd. So there are a number of changes we can make like that. In terms of the electoral system, Australia has an electoral system for its first past the post single member districts called the preferential voting, the alternative vote. In the United States, the term that's used is ranked choice voting. Instead of voting for a single candidate, by the way, this could not only be done in legislative districts, it could be done for mayors and county executives. It could also be done for the president of Taiwan. So instead of voting for only one candidate, with the risk, if there are more than two candidates running in the general election, that no one would get a majority of the vote, and you're electing someone only by a plurality. Instead of that, the voters are asked to rank their choices, 1, 2, 3, 4. Typically there won't be many more than that. And if no one gets a majority of the vote, the candidate with the lowest number of first preference votes is eliminated. This is typically the way it works. And then the votes for that candidate are redistributed to those voters' second preferences. It's literally called an instant runoff. And then those people who voted for a candidate who was eliminated, their votes are redistributed to the second preferences. And you see if someone now has a majority. And if someone still doesn't have 50% plus one, then you eliminate the next lowest finisher and redistribute their second or third preference votes. And this continues until someone gets a majority. In the simple illustration of this, you wouldn't have a president elected with 40% of the vote. And you wouldn't have to do the very polarizing thing, maybe controversial thing, that Brazil and France do, of having yet again another election 2 weeks, 4 weeks later, a runoff election, though I think that would be better than no runoff at all. But you could have an instant runoff. And then the candidates, all three of the candidates or four, would be saying, I'd better moderate my appeals a little bit because I might need the second preference votes
Of my opponents.
Supporters. In order to prevail in the instant runoff. This has been a very important element in Australia's democratic success. We have now had 2 states in the United States, Maine and Alaska, adopt it by voter referendum. 2 more states, Oregon and Nevada, are voting on it in referenda in November of this year, 2024. And it's an idea that's kind of gaining interest. Anyway, so, one could think of other innovations that might be of potential interest to democratic citizens in Taiwan. But the point is that every democracy can probably be better, right? And also, when you get new generations of democratic citizens, they have different and higher expectations. It's not only here in Taiwan where young voters are kind of unhappy with the choices they have and are looking at other candidates and maybe other parties. It's to some extent a global trend. We certainly see it in the United States. So if you want them to commit to democracy, if you want them to be involved, it's probably wise to increase the range of options, increase the way that they can become engaged to think about the future of their democracy, get them to recommit to and have confidence again in the country's institutions, and create mechanisms for organizing elections that reduce polarization, discourage extremism, and enable the candidate with the broadest support in society to ultimately prevail. In 2024, if that had happened, it might have been Lai Ching-te anyway, but then he would have could claim to have majority support rather than only 40%, or maybe it would have been somewhere else, or maybe there would have been a different campaign because each of the 3 candidates would know that they had to get to 50% plus 1.
I think that's brilliant. I think it directly addresses and incentivizes a candidate to run a type of campaign that would appeal to a broader segment of population.
Good. You've just grasped the logic of ranked choice voting.
I think it's fascinating. I think democracy takes work. You know better than anyone else. And being a democracy, not even 30 years old, I think we've got a lot of homework ahead and a lot is at stake. But having seen this election and the recent ones, we remain optimistic because we have so many young folks who care about politics. I want to get back to where we started. I did not forget you wanted to talk about Martin Luther King's using time creatively.
It is possible to imagine a scenario in which this is the last democratic election in Taiwan. Again, nice little democracy you had. Sorry to see it go. So using time creatively means thinking, first of all, appreciating you may not have a lot of time. And second of all, thinking very strategically about what you could do in the next 3 to 5, 6, 7 years to make the society resilient, survivable, adaptable, and undigestible in the way of a porcupine, that animal with quills on its back that not even a lion would dare swallow. So, it's doable. We're not despairing, your friends outside Taiwan, but time is no longer a luxury any longer. I believe, and a lot of people who've looked at this in very cold, sobering terms believe that we have entered a new and much more dangerous era. You have to take seriously, this is a lesson of authoritarian regimes, what megalomaniacal autocrats like Hitler, Mussolini, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping say. And if you take seriously what Xi Jinping is saying, it means Taiwan better use time very creatively in the next few years. And I don't think it should mean, oh, it's inevitable. There's no point defending ourselves. We'll just try and be sure to get on an airplane when it looks like it's going to happen. I don't think that is the sentiment of the majority of society, and I don't think it's necessary. And it would be a tragedy if it came to that, not only for Taiwan, but for all of Asia and the world. So there is time, but you must use it creatively.
Thank you so much. It's been such a treat. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.